So good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Talk Photography webinar, a step-by-step guide to light painting. Good evening, David. How are you, mate?
I'm well, thanks, Jay. Thanks for having me back. Are you all right?
Yes, I'm very good, thank you, my friend. And well, it's a
Good.
pleasure to have you back because we had a great response to part one. I think it was wise for me to say though, as much as if they haven't seen part one, it's just going to be a little bit more in-depth version of that. I know we're going to cover a lot more than we didn't cover last week, but it's not essential for them to see sort of the introduction. But of course, they can go back and look at it, right?
Exactly. Not they're very much two kind of separate overviews, if you like, but I would still recommend if you really want to immerse yourself in the world of light painting, it would be sensible to watch both of them, but they're kind of standalone, so nobody
Oh, of
worry about
course.
that.
And as I said, they're available on the Academy. It'll be on the YouTube channel in a couple of weeks. So, well worth checking out on that. David, just for those people that are joining us for the first time tonight, as we did last week, if we just quickly just ask you to sort of tell us a little bit about your journey into the full-time photographer that you are now.
Sure. Okay. Yep. So around 22 years ago, my goodness, I completed my fine art photography degree at the Glasgow School of Art. During that 4-year degree, I specialised and focused my time during that period on toys and macro photography. I became quite obsessed with miniature figurines, and that work continues to this day. But it wasn't until about maybe 10, 12 years ago that my attention turned to this wondrous world of light painting. When I was living in the Channel Islands, I had a lot of time in my hands in the evenings before we had our daughter, and I filled that time by heading out at night time and immersing myself in night photography. And then following on from just quite simply long exposure night photography, I kind of happened upon and discovered light painting for myself and became utterly obsessed with what is a truly magical process, which I'm hoping to share a lot more with you this evening.
Brilliant, mate. That was me muted. I'm talking to you, and I've got my mute button on, as I normally do. Right, look, we won't waste any time. Let's give you this. Let's give you the screen, Bud. So,
thanks, Jay. Okay, so without at the risk of this sounding like a straight plug for my ebook, which it kind of unavoidably partly is, I feel this is a really sensible thing to do this evening, and that is, as promised in the last session, this is a bit more of a deep dive exercise tonight. We're going to get a bit more technical and look at things like camera settings and what considerations need to be made before heading out into the night and immersing yourself in a light painting photography session. So we're going to rattle through some of the sections in the ebook. I'm merely using this as a kind of direct reference to aid me this evening whilst I'm speaking to you. And for those who missed last week's webinar, there's a light painting for you, so you can actually see one of the images we talked about briefly last week, and here it is again today. So we're going to look at a lot more imagery again this evening, but we're going to start by looking at some of the technical information as I just mentioned. So we'll zip through this quite quickly. We're not going to look at all of it. I'll let you have a quick browse. If you just run your eyes over the content, it's an incredibly detailed book that I wrote during lockdown. My main aim being, I adore sharing my passion for light painting. I teach regular physical workshops to other photographers, and of course, because of the nature of lockdown and social distancing, I put all of my energy into writing what I believe to be a really detailed manual, if you like, a how-to book, all about light painting, which features other light painters, the tools they make, where you can buy them, and so on. So tonight we're going to zip through this ebook, skip over some of the stuff we went over last week in terms of example images, and we're going to find the section that addresses camera settings. Here we go. So camera settings and other considerations. I think this is a good starting point for tonight because, like I say, this can be treated as a kind of standalone episode this evening, and where better to start than teaching you guys exactly how to set up your camera gear to go light painting, or just to quite simply go out and enjoy a long exposure night photo shoot. So first and foremost, some of this will be slight repetition from last week, but let's not worry about that. So bulb mode. Bulb mode on your cameras is going to allow you to surpass your camera's restrictive 30-second maximum exposure length, which it would max out on if you left it on manual mode. So bulb mode will allow you to push past that 30-second boundary and take exposures that are, almost pretty much infinitely long. Not that I'd take exposures that are too long unless I'm doing something like star trails. My exposures tend to be somewhere between maybe 4, 6, 7 minutes long, something like that. So bulb mode is an important starting point. ISO, this is an interesting one. I tend to always suggest that it's sensible to use a relatively low ISO when you're out on a night photography shoot or a light painting shoot. The main reason I've kind of always taken that line, certainly since the early days or in the early days, is because anyone that's ever dabbled with night photography, you'll know what noise means, and noise is that nasty little kind of pixelated grainy effect that you know litters your camera screen when you've captured a photograph in the darkness. It's your camera's sensor struggling to make sense of the incredibly dark conditions, and using a relatively low ISO number helps you minimize the noise levels. So I always recommend a low ISO number is a sensible starting point if you are indeed trying to minimize the noise levels. That's not to say you can't use a high ISO, just as a small caveat. I know some light painters that really pump the ISO up pretty high. We're talking maybe a couple of thousand, and use quite dulled down light painting tools, which react well to the high ISO, but I tend to use a low ISO, so that's kind of what we'll preach this evening. So I always use a relatively wide aperture number. Somewhere between around f4 and f8 is normally a pretty good range for the style of work that I make, and it's probably a sensible time to also point out that, albeit not a super wide aperture like f2.8 or something like that, it's still wide enough to allow enough ambient light into the lens to make the exposure length not ridiculously long, and also allows the light painting tools to function pretty normally around those settings as well. Okay, I'm not sure we need to get into too much detail on that just now. I have used pretty wide F numbers for star trail work for obvious reasons, because you need to let as much light in as possible. But again, kind of harking back to last week's webinar, I tend to work under, my favorite conditions are working anywhere between a half moon and a full moon, and that's because the moonlight helps to expose the surrounding landscape in which I'm working, which is really important for the kind of images that I enjoy making. So just bear that in mind as well. So AF, MF, autofocus, manual focus, this is a really important point to convey, certainly early on, because when I teach my workshops, it's the one thing a lot of people that speak to me about attempting to light paint have had an issue with, and that is focusing the camera in the dark. Now, of course, cameras do not enjoy trying to focus in the dark. For obvious reasons, they've got nothing to see, to focus, to latch onto. And so what I tend to do when I'm out light painting and I'm in a night setting is I'll use a relatively powerful torch to illuminate the landscape or a subject matter within the landscape. And using autofocus, I will allow my camera to focus on said subject matter. And once I know my camera has focused on that point, I'll then switch back to manual focus, which means the focal point is now locked onto that area in the landscape. And any image I take thereafter with my camera, of course, perched in a tripod, I know that image is going to be nice and sharp around that subject matter area within the landscape, which is normally where I go light painting around an interesting feature within the landscape. I hope that makes good sense to everyone. If not, you can ask me more about that shortly. So white balance, we had a question about this last week. I tend to always use auto white balance, AWB. I've rarely had any need to alter that. And of course, I should, like many of you listening, shoot in RAW format. And when I upload my work in for post editing in Lightroom, which is what I primarily use, you can alter the white balance settings on the RAW file within Lightroom anyway, so it's not a big issue. I always leave it on auto white balance. Image stabilization mode. This is a really interesting one. If your lens has an IS mode on it and your camera is placed on a tripod, which it should be if you're running long exposures, because you want to keep the camera nice and steady, switch your image stabilizer mode off. The reason we do this is because IS mode is obviously really handy if you're doing handheld photography, like maybe sports or nature photography, and you've got a fast moving subject matter. But because the camera is static anyway, because it's sat in a tripod, you really don't need that functionality. And perversely, if you left the image stabilization mode switched on, it can actually create very small vibrations within the lens as it goes looking for vibrations to cancel them out. Slightly odd. So just remember to switch your IS mode off. That's a good tip, that. And format, as I just mentioned, I always shoot in RAW formatting. If you're only used to shooting in JPEG, that is absolutely fine. When I teach others about my photography practice, I do always recommend to shoot in RAW format, primarily because it's the largest image file your camera is going to produce, and therefore there's a lot more information and data within that image, which is helpful in the post-editing process if you use things like Lightroom to tweak your work thereafter. LENR, long exposure noise reduction. Now, this little setting in my camera caught me out a few times in the early days when I was running really long exposures. I didn't realize this setting in my camera was actually automatically switched on. And I found out the hard way one night after I think it was a 30 or 40 minute long star trail, long exposure. And after I ended the exposure, my camera's light went red on the back of the screen. And guess what? I had to wait another 40 minutes just to see the image preview flash up in the back of my camera, because long exposure noise reduction, as the name implies, it does what it says in the tin. It goes looking through the image you've just captured and tries to strip out the noise levels, which is really helpful. But if you're using a relatively low ISO, or you're using something like Lightroom where you can actually minimize the noise levels anyway, it renders this setting pretty much useless. And like I say, it just doubles the length of time you have to wait to see the image you've just captured, which can be very frustrating if you've just spent, well, even just a few minutes capturing a shot. Focusing tips. Okay, this is an interesting one because there's a couple of different ways of approaching this. What I tend to do, we touched upon this last week in the webinar. I stand behind my camera in the darkened landscape, and I use a bright torch to illuminate the landscape in front of the camera, and I choose a point within that landscape to focus on. We just touched upon that a moment ago with autofocus and manual focus. Or you can actually put something into the shot, like I sometimes use this kind of lightsaber tool that I've got, and I'll place that in the shot at an area I want to focus on, and my camera will be able to pick out that bright spot in the image frame and focus onto that point before I then thereafter revert back to switching the lens to manual focus. But I would always recommend it's just easier and more practical. Stand behind your camera and tripod, use a bright torch to illuminate the landscape, pick your point to focus on, set it using autofocus, and then switch back to manual focus. Tips for beach photography. Now, in the very early days of becoming really interested in long exposure photography, and then a bit latterly after that, light painting, I made countless trips to the beach on Guernsey, where I used to live, and would come home at night wondering why on earth my images weren't pin sharp. And it was because even although I thought the sand was really firm, the tripod legs were actually really slowly sinking into the sand. And so a little tip I picked up from a friend is you can use old CDs or drinks coasters or little mini frisbees underneath the tripod legs, just to give the tripod that little bit extra stability on the sand, which eradicates that issue happening. Just a little thing to bear in mind in case anyone gets affected by that. I found that little tip invaluable at the time. Clothing. Again, we briefly talked about this last week, but it's important to reiterate these really key things. I always wear or tend to wear very dark clothing when I'm out light painting, because the idea is you want to blend into the night landscape that you're surrounded by. You don't want the camera to pick you up when you're light painting, unless, of course, you're wanting to intentionally show up in the final shot. So I tend to wear dark clothing, and the rules are dark clothing, continually move around while you're light painting, and try to avoid illuminating yourself. If you follow those three kind of key rules, you should remain completely invisible in your final shot. Location is incredibly important. I always normally try to visit the location I have in mind where I'm going to go light painting during the daytime hours, partly so that I can kind of envision how I'm going to maybe frame the shot and have a think about the structure or the composition of what I want to actually achieve through my light painting imagery. But also from a safety standpoint, it's a really useful piece of advice, because, you know, going to a location when it's pitch black or really dark is a completely different proposition. I promise you, to going there during the daytime, it's good to be familiar with the landscape in which you're going to be working before it gets really dark. Even just turn up a little bit before the sun sets. That's a good tip as well. And familiarize yourself with anything you might be able to fall over while you're kind of making the work in the dark. Moon cycles, incredibly important. Again, I always I have a moon cycle calendar that I frequently reference. This just allows me to kind of work out roughly when I want to go light painting. Like I mentioned earlier, my favorite conditions are anywhere between a half moon and a full moon, because that little bit of extra light that the moon's producing during the long exposure just helps to expose the landscape sufficiently. and weather forecast, really key, especially if you live in Britain. My goodness, the west of Scotland, this can get fun. So I use a really detailed weather forecasting system. There's a few out there just to track wind and rain. Those two things can really put a swift end to a night photography shoot. I'll just very quickly see if there's anything else. We looked at a lot of tools last week. We're going to look at some more tools shortly. I think we're going to jump into a different folder in just a second. Yes, we are, because I know what's coming next. I'll tell you what, I'll show you really quickly. If I just scroll down, this little section in my book is called the Full Monty, and this is quite a helpful sort of walkthrough of the process from start to finish. We'll just whiz through this really quickly, but I normally start by just a really simple camera gear checklist. I make sure my camera is fully charged, the battery's charged, got an SD card in it, is got the attachment for the tripod, and my cable release is functioning on long exposure mode. Do that before you go anywhere. You should be fine once you arrive on location. Where are you going to be light painting? What kind of work are you going to be making? These are important questions to be asking yourself. What light painting tools do you need to make the kind of light painting you have in mind? Assessing your surroundings, again, like I mentioned a moment ago, really important to just have a think about any features in the landscape you maybe want to accentuate or work next to when you're light painting. Setting up the camera gear on location. I tend to arrive a little bit before sundown sometimes, just to make sure there's a bit of ambient light around to help me get set up, or I'll wear a head torch. Setting your focal point, we've just covered that. Camera settings, we've just ran through that as well. And then test shots, really important to do this. Always run a few test shots before you actually start light painting to make sure you're happy with the exposure level for the landscape first and foremost. There's no point in driving for an hour or two to get to a special location if you're not going to effectively expose for the landscape itself before you get into the really exciting part of light painting. And then of course the final shot. We looked at this image last week in a kind of step-by-step tutorial. We'll skip that in detail tonight, but you get the idea. The final shot is once you're happy with, once you've got that kind of exposure locked in for the landscape, you can then really get stuck in and start light painting. So we'll jump out of here. We're going to jump into the next folder shortly. Jay, do you want to maybe quickly pause and see if there's any questions?
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's a question. It sounds like more of a bit of a statement, but you might know better than me. When you were talking about the image stabilization, obviously on your lens,
yes.
Phil's just mentioned that Sony users, I presume he's referring to like the mirrorless ones, often have the in-body image stabilization now as well. So again, I think it's a statement to turn it off is the way I'm reading it for those possible units. Is something you're familiar with at all, David?
Well, as I said a moment ago, I always switch your IS mode to off.
Yeah.
It can misbehave. It can cause camera vibration.
Well, I think the way Phil has written it, that it's advice rather than a question, to be honest. So I think that makes total sense.
If he's reiterating that point, it's a good one to remember, because it's such a small little switch in your lens that you can forget to switch off.
Okay, something's just come in. Let me just quickly read it. Oh, okay. Well, it's a good question. Do you feel light painting is the newest trend in photography? Is it more desirable and engaging for people, e.g. advertisements, fine art, etc.? So a question, I guess.
Well, let's not get into the fine art question. Is it art? My goodness, we could have a whole seminar just on that question, couldn't we? It's a big one. Yes, it's a really good question, and I recently had a really, in fact, I'll show you some of his work shortly. We're going to come on to a chap called Dennis Smith in just a moment. He lives in Australia, and me and Dennis have been around light painting for at least 12 years together at opposite ends of the world. And maybe about 12 years ago, there was the website Flickr, which kind of holds a whole bunch of, it's like the Facebook for photographers, basically. If you don't know about it, check it out. There's a group on Flickr called Light Junkies, and this group was created maybe something like 12, 13 years ago. And it's interesting. So light painting has been such a growing movement over certainly the past 10 years. And it's no coincidence that that's kind of coincided with the dawn and birth of really decent digital cameras. Light painting's, like I said the last time we spoke, light painting's been around for a very long time, decades and decades. Picasso and Man Ray dabbled with it. But there's a kind of new wave, a kind of a new era, if you like, a contemporary light painting movement, which is in full swing right now. And if you go over to Flickr and have a look at the Light Junkies group on there, you'll see some absolutely magnificent work that's been made over the last 10, 12 years. And me and Dennis were around what felt like the kind of early stages of this kind of renaissance, if you like, and kind of new movement of light painters evolving and creating new tools and experimenting with new techniques. And I think light painting's become so accessible to so many more people now because of digital cameras, because you get that preview screen in the back of the camera. You can immediately see the results of what you've made. You don't have to send the film away to get developed to realize you've made a complete hash of things, and you know, you have to work out how to go light painting again and correct your mistakes over a matter of weeks. You can do that in seconds now. I hope that partly answers the question. But yes, I think it's certainly trending, let's put it that way. And I've certainly had several really interesting commissions come my way from various businesses and institutions that have wanted marketing imagery made, with light painting being the kind of key theme behind the imagery. Quite exciting times if you're into light painting.
Brilliant. Yeah, so Phil's advice with the Sony was advice, which I thought it was. So it is
Okay.
the setting in there. David, I don't know if you're familiar. We've had a specific question, and then we'll move on and hang on to the rest for because they're general. But I guess it's staying with this. The new sort of mirrorless systems. I know it's specific about a brand that you might not be familiar with. It's Olympus.
Okay.
The lady saying, and hi Jane, she says hi from Jersey. So hi Jane.
Hi. Oh, Jersey, there we go. Guernsey's neighbouring island.
On her Olympus, she has a live bulb and a live time setting. Do you know which would be better for her?
The answer is no. I'll be really quick and honest about that because I don't use Olympus and I'm not overly familiar with them. Again, Jane, hello. The chap we're going to speak about in just a second, one of the light painters I'll briefly feature tonight, is called Dennis Smith. Dennis with one N. He's in Australia. He is an Olympus visionary. What a name! There we go.
Yeah.
He represents their brand and their cameras. He knows a lot about the Olympus settings. Fire him a message. He's a lovely chap. He'd be happy to help, I'm sure.
Brilliant, mate. Look, we've had a question about what lights and kit to use, and I know that's the next section we're getting into, mate. So
yeah,
I'll hang on to everything else I've got, and we'll crack on, pal.
All right, Jay. Thanks. So yes, we are going to sort of dive into light painting tools now. We looked at light painting tools also in a lot of detail last week, so go and check out seminar or webinar number 1 because that covers a whole bunch of tools we're not going to specifically look at tonight, but I'm going to show you some specialist tools this evening. As I mentioned a minute ago when I was answering that question, we're living in a really exciting period of photography, particularly for light painting and light painters, because as this process evolves and as photographers better understand how to go light painting and what lights react best for creating certain effects, light painters have now become the crafters of their own light painting tools. And you can, maybe if you can just make his name out there, he's named Dennis Smith. He used to be, he's a great bloke. He's become such a good friend of mine. We used to be almost like rivals in the early days of orb spinning, creating orbs, spinning lights around to create these kind of lovely sphere-shaped objects of light. And Dennis very cleverly went away and crafted this beautiful tool that you spin around. As you can see, it's coated in LEDs on one side, and it's a wire device that you kind of spin next to your hip. You rotate it to create the orbs. You'll see the effect that Dennis creates using that lovely tool here. As I say, he's based out in Australia, and he's got an absolutely stunning library of work that he shares online. So go check him out. He sells all of his tools through his website, which is always useful for people to know because these tools are not exclusive. They're very easy to access and purchase. Just going to show you a couple of examples of his work. I don't normally show other people's work when I'm doing my own webinars, but I've kind of relaxed about this recently because you'll discover this if you get into light painting. It's such a sharing community to be a part of. People love assisting and helping each other out that are getting into light painting. I think partly because it's such a beautiful and relaxing and magical process. This is another tool that Dennis crafts called light flutes. They're just bits of insulation piping or piping that he cuts different shapes into, and it attaches to the head of a torch. And he then spins these flutes around. I've got some as well. They're so much fun to use. They kind of whistle while you use them, which is why I think they're called light flutes. And he makes, as you can see, stunning work within the water itself and on land. really striking effects using what are in essence really quite simplistic tools. So this is another photographer. He's based in Canada. He's called Eric Paré. He's again got a wonderful product range of tools that he's now sharing with the world. This one's called a hollow square. You can maybe just kind of make out what's going on there. He kind of illuminates this material with torchlight, and then moves the material around to freeze the light into the space. And I think we had this question last week, you know, do I know much about, or have I dabbled with light painting portraiture? Well, Eric is your man, let me tell you. He works closely with his fiance, and most of his work, if not nearly all of it, features her in some of the images that he's made. They're truly beautiful. These are the light tubes that he has crafted, again, that are just simply attached to the end of a torch fitting. They use this really lovely kind of luminescent material, which creates this beautiful quality of light when you go light painting with it. I'll show you some examples next. So here we are, using what I can only guess is a slightly higher ISO setting. This is why I hesitate to, when I talk about ISOs, it's not a necessity. It depends how precious you are about noise levels, really. But look at those stars; they're completely frozen into the shot. They're barely moving, so that's a relatively, you know, low shutter time. And he uses these tools. He stands behind his fiancée and spins them around to kind of not only freeze her into the space, but also the light painting tool itself. Quite beautiful. And it's kind of luminescent and transparent. You can actually see the landscape just kind of sneaking through the back, which is a nice aesthetic as well. And like I say, he's got a whole array of different light tubes that he uses, and he sometimes attaches maybe a bit of magnesium or steel wool to the end, or sparklers, which creates that lovely kind of fiery effect that's coming off the edge. But my goodness, he makes his way into some quite stunning locations and settings. Quite beautiful. Okay, here's an interesting one. So this chap we're going to look at briefly is called Jason Page. He is in Florida, I believe, in America. Really good guy as well, and he came up with this really simplistic system a handful of years ago. And this little piece of rubber doesn't look like much, but it's genius. It attaches to the end of a torch. You can maybe get the gist of it better when I pull this image up. See that bottom right image? There's a torch just kind of poking out the end of that little rubber stopper there. So the idea is you attach, you basically stick a torch up the backside of this little rubber stopper, and the top of the rubber stopper is ridged, which allows different tools to be inserted into the top of it, which means it's a really it's a really ambidextrous tool. You can use a whole host of different fittings to go light painting with to create different effects. We'll have a look at a couple now. So ranging from the really simplistic, so this is Jason's colored gel range, where they're beautifully kind of encapsulated in this black plastic, and you can direct the light into the landscape to actually illuminate the landscape in a whole array of different wonderful colors. Or you can use his blade attachments. As you can see, that stunning image in the right where he's walked into the water there, and looks like he's repeatedly switched the torch on and off, or put it on some kind of strobe mode, and created these kind of beautiful angel wings behind the model there. Quite beautiful. Now this chap here is called Patrick Rushol. He is Canadian, French Canadian, and he has created this beautiful system, again, really quite simplistic. It's called the light blade system. And this little kind of, on the left-hand side here, you'll see this kind of metallic shaped attachment. This screws onto the top of a certain type of torch make. And within that little shape, there's a space in the middle to which you can attach acrylic shapes, which you can see here. He's got all sorts of different funky names for them. And as you can imagine, the light being emitted by the torch shoots up through the torch and disperses through the acrylic head that you attach to the torch, which you can add gels to and color in with pens. They're so versatile, and you can create some really interesting effects using these tools. Here's a picture of the tool kind of frozen into the light painting that he's made, which just kind of gives you a good kind of idea of what's going on. We're going to look more at abstract light painting a little bit later on, because I think it's quite an interesting topic. And here's just a quick snapshot of some of the effects that we'll look at in a bit more detail shortly. me just kind of experimenting with different attachments on the light blade fitting. Now, someone asked about this last week, and I agreed to share this secret tonight. I spin my orbs in a very different way to Dennis Smith, who we looked at just a moment ago. He created this lovely kind of wire, refined kind of wire tool with a lovely kind of switch button remote at the end of it. I use a far more kind of rudimentary approach, but this works really well for me and always has done. I teach this in my workshops because it allows people to grasp the concept really quickly, and it almost virtually guarantees really exact results, almost from the off. So as you can see, I've got a drill to which I attach a metal pole to using a bolt that I've drilled through the middle of the pole. And at each end of that metal pole, which is 2 meters long, by the way, I attach these little finger LEDs that I buy off eBay or Amazon. They're very cheap. I switch them on. I walk into the landscape. This is daytime for the purposes of showing you guys how the system works. And I spill this pole around as straight as I can in front of me. And if you can just make that out on the computer screen, I've put a little white pebble on the sand. Now I need to aim at that white pebble every time the light passes over the ground, and that will guarantee that I'm creating a really even orb or ball of light, whatever you want to call it, sphere of light. And here they are. So using that tool, this system right here, I spin the pole around with the lights on the end and create these globes or orbs of light within the landscape. And as we mentioned briefly last week, in a lot of the light painting work that you'll see, especially outdoors, you can normally, if it's been a clear night, see the stars streaking across the sky, which will give you a rough indication of how long the exposure has been. Always one of my favorite images, this, a double orb, which is quite difficult to master. And some little butterflies that I've flashed into the shot using a little butterfly template, using a small butterfly template, and then using a torch. I think it was a flash gun, in fact, in this instance, to illuminate the brickwork from behind the camera. And we're back to the beginning of the tools section. So hopefully you guys found that useful in conjunction with what we looked at last week, because we looked at a whole bunch of tools last week as well. So there we have it, some other light painters and their tools, which I think is really good value telling you about tonight, because it's important to know where you can find these kind of more specialist tools. Jay, do we have any more questions?
Yes, I do. We've actually, on the Olympus note, we've got a couple of Olympus users online with us tonight, and they're saying that they're saying it is the live time mode. If I'm reading it correctly, it allows you to open the shutter and close it with a press of the button, whereas the live bulb sounds like it's a little bit more automatic and takes a bit of control out of the mix there. So it seems to be, but they also said, check in with Dennis, as you said, uses it.
Yeah, feel free. So I'm sure he won't mind. Just bear in mind, I use a Canon 5D Mark III. I've got quite a clunky, large DSLR camera, which I'm very fluent with. So yeah, when it comes to all these little idiosyncratic settings, I'm afraid sometimes it's a little bit tricky to answer them quickly. But
of course,
yeah, we'll get there.
Yeah, brilliant. This is a question, David, but I thought it was interesting. I know it's not easy to use a drone in the dark, but I was wondered if you've ever thought about using one and having the lights coming from it.
I have not done any drone photography to date. It's something that I get very itchy feet when I've got so many ideas running through my brain just from you mentioning the word drone. I have seen some absolutely stunning light paintings created by drones, so it's not a brand new idea. Let me just say that. And if you want to go online and hunt down some imagery, there are images of drone light painting online. Go and find them. It's fascinating. I've seen people directing lights directly down at the ground from a drone and drawing around, for example, a kind of a castle structure, a kind of dilapidated castle, and the light, because it's facing down from the drone, it creates a lovely circle of light in the sky, floating in the sky, and also illuminates the subject matter from above. It can be absolutely astounding. It's I'm desperate to try this at some point.
Brilliant, mate. A couple of things have come up. A few people have said about the tools and the accessories, and obviously you've talked about a lot of the specific people. Maybe you could put a list together and I could share it with them on the Photographer Academy on the Facebook.
Yep.
So
I'm happy to reference the tools we just looked at, and you can post them up.
Brilliant.
Probably worthwhile me reiterating. We covered a lot last week, but my ebook contains an insane amount of information on settings and tools. There are so many tools out there now. Like I say, this process has been evolving at quite a rate over the last maybe 12 years, and some of the tools which you can make at home, by the way, are pretty easy to construct and throw together. My goodness, yeah, I promise you, once you start making light painting tools and mucking around with, you can use things like cheese graters, believe it or not. Anything that kind of emits light from interesting shapes can be used to go light painting with. Your brain will just start running away. It's yeah, the more imaginative you get with this process, the better.
Brilliant. Sorry, let me just remove some of these questions because I've asked them and I think I'll ask them again. Well, we know the answer to this because obviously we talked about it last week, but do you use the pixel stick and is it worth getting? Are we going to touch on that again later?
We're not going to touch on it later. I don't think there's much need to. If you reference the first webinar, it's mostly in there. But I'm happy to plug it, mention it tonight. It is an amazing tool. Upsides and downsides of the pixel stick, we touched upon these briefly before, but I like the pixel stick because you can light paint specific imagery into the landscape, which is just mind-blowing when you see it actually happening. It really is an incredible tool, but I also find it slightly limiting because of that kind of two-dimensional aspect we spoke about last week.
Yeah.
When I go out and make these kind of more organic shapes like ribbons and orbs, they're fully three-dimensional. The light fills the space. They're very sculptural. The pixel stick, unless you really throw that thing around, which is quite a cumbersome thing to be, it's 2 meters long and quite heavy. It can be quite hard work and a bit clumsy, but it is an amazing tool if used in the right way, definitely.
Interesting that you've got another double orb image here on the screen now, David. We did have a question about the one with the double orb and the butterflies in that cavern thing that we also saw last week. The question was, what order in the sequence is the painting made? So was it the bigger orb, smaller orb, or vice versa? And was the butterflies last but one, and then the flash to the surroundings? What order was that sort of sequence in, mate?
Yeah, good question. So I started by walking into the space. I used a marker in the ground, like I mentioned briefly earlier. To spin the orbs, you need to be kind of aiming at something in the ground. So I had something small in the ground, maybe a 5p piece coin or something to kind of aim the light at. I spun the small orb first. I then spun the larger orb second to that. The reason being that I wanted the second orb to look like it was encapsulating the first. If you see what I mean, the light would have gone over the top of the first one, in essence, in that order. I then sort of probably quite clumsily bumbled around the space with my little butterfly template, flashed it multiple times throughout the space, and then stood behind the tripod, kept my fingers crossed. I'd already worked out what power of flash gun to use. I think it was on 50% power. Flashed the flash gun into the space to sort of bring out the brickwork and illuminate the space. Stopped the exposure, and hey presto, it probably took me a few attempts. Some of the light paintings do. Sometimes you get lucky and you nail it in the first go.
Brilliant. And just one, even though I know we covered it last week, it's come up tonight. You don't ever stack your images, do you, David? So it's not image stacking
Never.
in any way. No. Brilliant.
No, I don't. I wouldn't say I'm against. Well, I'm against it if people start uploading work online, and are receiving lots of praise for this incredible light painting they've created without mentioning that it's been stacked. I think a lot of light painters, certainly the ones that I know, of which there are many that do this professionally, they pride themselves on the fact that they post imagery that they've managed to accomplish through a single long exposure. That's kind of part of the challenge and where the skill lies, if you ask me. I'm a bit of a purist when it comes to that one. But yeah, I've seen people stacking images and I've got no issue with that at all if they kind of reference the fact that that's what they've done.
So quickly before we move on, because it's just coming quickly, so we'll use this image now of the orbs that you have in front of you. The question was, is there a way, is it to make the colours so strong, is it, when you're spinning each, in this instance with the orb, is it how many rotations is it before you move, David? Does that make a difference to the strength of the colour?
It does. I mean, if I just stood there and continually moved around, kind of walked around that spot 5-6 times, something silly like that, then yes, what would happen is the orb would eventually just overexpose. There'd be too much light. I normally walk around at least one full 360. On this particular occasion, just looking at it, it looks like I probably went round twice. The reason I know that is because the lines are quite tight and condensed. So it looks like I've gone round twice, because if you just go around one time, sometimes you'll get quite a gappy orb. There'll be lots of spaces within it, unless you spin the pole really quickly. But yeah, again, I normally do a test shot for the landscape itself, make sure I'm happy with that. And then I'll kind of build up to the light painting as well. I'll maybe spin the small orb first, make sure I've got the color the way I want it, and then I'll spin the second one. And once I'm happy with everything, I'll just go for the final shot.
Brilliant. I'll leave you crack on, mate. I've only got a couple that I'm hanging on to, but we'll do those in the generic.
No worries.
Cool.
All right, Jay, thanks. So as promised, it gets a little bit boring, doesn't it, if we don't actually look at light painting work. We've been through some of the technical stuff, which I hope made sense to everybody. If not, continue to fire us questions. Let's look at some of the light paintings that I've created that we didn't look at last week. I think these are all new ones. So if you're joining again this week, these should be quite fresh. So this is the Isle of Arran up here in Scotland. This image, albeit relatively pretty to look at, my goodness, it doth lie, I tell you, my goodness. I don't know if you guys have encountered midges up in Scotland. They're like tiny mosquitoes, and they're a nightmare when it's the summer months and they are in abundance, because I dragged my poor wife out with me this night into the middle of this moor. It's called Macri Moor on the Isle of Arran, and all seemed to be well until the last of the sun set. And then, oh my goodness, droves and droves, millions of midges just appeared from all of the undergrowth and absolutely covered us. And we didn't have midgie nettings over our faces, so we got absolutely swarmed, bitten to bits. I think I managed to make maybe 2 or 3 images that night before we retreated back toward the car. It's funny how, same with any kind of photography, you always remember the story behind the image, don't you? That was a particularly traumatic light painting night. This is quite a cool one, partly because I've left the shutter, as you can see, running for longer than I usually do in my light painting shoots. Instead of just focusing on the star trails, I've kind of tried to combine the orbs with some underlighting of the concrete platform that I was stood upon, and then just let the rest of the exposure, once I'd finished the light painting element, just burn in to get this nice spin from the North Star behind the light painting itself. Again, just a bit of careful placement with the tripod and lens to find the North Star, and then a little bit of thought towards how I wanted to light the platform, and then I already had in mind that I wanted to spin a couple of orbs on top. So there we have it, a few things going on in that image, and again, just a single long exposure with some star trails for good measure. A really early light painting of mine, I used to be so proud of this image, I still am. I think I've made better work since then, but this will always be quite a special image for me, because it was one of the very first multiple orb shots that I attempted. You can see my footprints all over the sand as evidence that I was indeed running around the sand back and forward and so on. And you can see again quite a long exposure, because you can see the stars really starting to spin through the night sky. And I've stood out of shot to the right of the tripod, out the frame, and you'll see how the sand's got this lovely kind of dappled light across it. I've actually used a torch to encourage the exposure along and actually illuminate the sand to help expose the landscape as well. Probably quite a dark night. I don't think there was much moonlight that evening, which is why I had to kind of help bolster the exposure by using a torch. And I've always, this is a really interesting image as well. I will touch upon this. I wasn't going to. I love the fact, I find light painting not only magical, but just so poetic. I briefly touched upon this last week. You walk into the shot, you make the work, you exit stage right, and you're completely invisible. And the only trace, that you leave behind that you were actually there are these floating, intangible sculptures of light. I find that whole process, even to this day, after doing this for so much over the last 12 years, utterly magical. I implore everyone out there to give this a go if you haven't yet tried light painting. It's incredibly therapeutic. I know people in Guernsey that I used to light paint with, here's a good one, that suffered from depression and used light painting to help kind of alleviate the symptoms. Like I say, it's a very relaxing and therapeutic process. So yeah, I encourage people to light paint for many reasons. A slightly different image here. So this image belongs to part of a series of work I made in a tower block in Guernsey. I just wanted to show a couple of these because it's quite interesting when you take light painting indoors, as some people do a lot. I don't do it so much. I prefer to light paint in the landscape. But of course, during lockdown, that's not been possible. So if you want to try light painting at home, you can light paint in a room. And here we go. This was an empty block of flats. I think it was 8 stories high, and I managed to get special permission from the States of Guernsey to access this building at night time and create a series of light paintings throughout it. It was terrifying making this work because all of the doors were slamming in the dark, and it was very creepy. And the police rushed the building, stormed the building one evening because they thought we were up to no good. The States hadn't informed them it was in use, and they thought we'd broken in and were up to no good. All ended well, and they actually came to the final exhibition in the end. We were all friends at the end. My goodness, again, I will never forget that night. You can laugh at my expense, don't worry. So here we are. I think this was up in the 4th or 5th floor. Oh no, this was right up the top. I can see the ladder at the back going up to the attic. This was right up the top floor. Quite a haunting place. And the idea was that I would place these repetitive orb structures throughout all the different rooms, and the rooms were all virtually identical. The hallways and the rooms themselves all mirrored each other. It was very shining, very strange place, and quite a fascinating body of work in the end. Not sure I'd recommend you give this a go, but this again was an incredibly dark night. I've used the torchlight to help illuminate the grass and the haystacks, and I've climbed up on top. Those haystacks were massive. I remember it was about 3 or 4 meters up, and they were quite slippy. So I took my life in my hands this evening, and I just thought the stars would look amazing because they were so bright and they were just kind of filtering through the cloud. Quite a striking effect. And here we are back in the Isle of Arran. This is one of the only 2 or 3 shots I managed to capture this night, but I wanted to show this briefly this evening because, again, a completely different tool, custom built tool, using strip LED lights that have just been attached to a battery pack and a little color changing. I think they come with a color changing unit built within them. So the LEDs actually cycle through 7 different colors, and by moving this kind of light wand device around in the dark, it creates this lovely kind of 3-dimensional ribbon effect. And here we are up in the Isle of Lewis, using the same tool. Standing stones just make such amazing subject matter and features for light painting with. I need to find more. But yeah, again, that was a very memorable night, not least because we got absolutely soaked and caught in a shower of civil hailstorms. You have to suffer for your art. And here we are using the same tool, that kind of LED wand, in a completely different way, a bit more kind of 2-dimensionally, and just kind of waving it back and forward in front of the camera in a kind of uniform fashion to create this kind of symmetrical, almost looks like a kind of apple shape. Right, someone asked about the pixel stick earlier. We will look at a couple of examples using the pixel stick now. As I mentioned earlier, the pixel stick, if you're not familiar with it or haven't heard of it, is this crazy light painting tool. It's 2 meters high. It's got 200 LEDs running along the face of it, and you can actually upload specific imagery into the SD card slot, and it light paints specific images into the landscape or into the space you're working. It's quite mind-blowing when you see it working. It doesn't look like it should be doing what it actually does because the lights just kind of flash sporadically on the face of it as you're walking along, and then you come back to the back of the camera, and hey presto, you see what it's actually created, and it's mind-blowing. Here's a bit more fun. This is the outdoor bathing pool area in the Channel Islands that I so loved working next to when I was kind of experimenting with new tools. This was a very early outing with a pixel stick once it just arrived from America, and that's me uploading some fun images and paying homage to Pac-Man, who's being hunted down by a pack of ghosts. And here's the pixel stick being used in a completely different fashion. This is during one of my many workshops, light painting workshops, where I've got the group that I'm teaching to stand in a row, in a line, strike a pose, and I've literally walked in behind them and just ran the pixel stick from one end of the room to the other and just kind of silhouetted them and froze them into the space. This is maybe not the most striking image, but it's got a great story behind it. So my mate Kev on Guernsey, who really enjoyed light painting, we went light painting a lot together when I lived down there. He was really into stunt kite photography. He would fly a camera up on his stunt kite and take aerial shots of the island. And one evening, he said to me, "Wouldn't it be great to fly some burning wire wool on the stunt kite up into the sky during a long exposure, and we'll capture the effect?" So that's exactly what we did. That's why you can see this kind of almost bleeding effect down from the sky of the wire wool as it kind of burns onto the ground. But, you know, applying simple logic to the situation here, the stunt kite caught fire and came crashing down. End of stunt kite. We both laughed. It wasn't his expensive one. And here we are, back to something a bit more simplistic. So star trail photography, just running a really long exposure once you've found Polaris or the North Star in the background, so that the stars spin around that central point. And then some really, really simplistic light painting. I think I had one of my tools, I think my lightsaber, I set it to pink mode, placed it inside that little concrete cabin, and stood back and ran a long exposure. And I really like that image. Really, really straightforward, not difficult to make, but quite punchy, quite powerful image. And here we are at Loch Lomond here in Scotland. That's about maybe 50 minutes away from my house. This is where I take groups out to teach outdoor workshops, and I love this spot. You may well recognise this tree. It's one of the most photographed trees in Scotland, if not Britain. It's out at a lovely place called Millerrocky Bay. And yeah, it's a bit stony, as you can see. You've got to be kind of careful with your footing, but a great playground for light painting. That's just me walking backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards, running a kind of lightsaber device in front of the camera to kind of coat the ground in these kind of awesome waves of neon light. And here's probably the third and final image we got to make on Arran during the Midgie battle we had. Really straightforward light painting. I wanted to show this because, again, a completely different approach and technique. So incredibly straightforward. I'm just standing in the shot, just kind of peeking out from behind the stone structure there, and I'm just firing a torch directly at the camera, which is on a tripod. I'm flashing the torch really quickly, once, twice, 3 times, 9 times, and the flashing of the torch directly into the camera lens is creating this kind of wonderful kind of starburst effect. It looks very kind of otherworldly and kind of a bit sci-fi. And physiograms, if you want to learn more about this particular technique, reference back to last week's webinar if you like. But this is essentially spinning a light from the ceiling that's suspended from the ceiling and aiming the camera directly up at the ceiling, and using little gels just to change the color of the LED that's hanging. And gravity, believe it or not, takes over and does the hard work for you. Those lovely shapes, that kind of chrysalis of light has been created by the light swinging and slowly coming to a standstill at the bottom there. And that's another physiogram, as they've come to be known, just photographed with the tripod raised up a bit higher to create a completely different shape and effect. It looks more like a kind of basket of light. It's quite an interesting one, that I like it, very 3-dimensional. And there we are, back to the beginning of that particular set. So again, a good time to break for questions, Jay.
Yeah, got a couple for you, Bud.
Sure.
I think I've just put it back out there. I think they're referring to star trails, albeit it's been written as starburst. But typical f-stop for shooting the star trails, David?
Yeah, so I've approached star trail photography on its own, so without light painting, in a couple of different ways. The ones with light paintings in them, they are 100% single long exposures, and I've walked in and added the light painting, and then, like I said earlier, just let the exposure run and run and run for the stars to burn into the image. I normally use a slightly wider aperture for star trail photography, maybe something like f3.5, something like that, to 2.8, depending on what lens you have. I wouldn't go super wide, because sometimes you'll get a nasty bit of vignetting, or the lens just won't cope as well at its widest aperture. But yeah, relatively wide aperture, and sometimes a higher ISO. Like I say, there's another way of doing star trails which I learned, which I actually think works a lot better. And this is coming back to that interesting question from earlier, stacking, because I have used stacking for light trail photography alone. And the trick is to take shorter bursts, so maybe 30-second long exposures, using a much higher ISO, so maybe ISO 1000 or 2000, and a relatively wide aperture in conjunction with the high ISO. Take a series of 30-second long exposures, one after the other. Some remote trigger devices allow you to pre-program how many shots you want to take, one after the other, which is quite useful. And then you stack all of those images together once you've maybe taken 60 of them. So you've got 30 minutes of imagery stacked together. And then you just plug those images into one of the many software programs online that stack star, specifically built for stacking star trail images. and it fuses all those images together. And that because of the higher ISO setting, the stars come out a lot brighter, which is really a really helpful tip for anyone that wants to really get stuck into star trail photography.
Brilliant. Well, that was really good information, but I did have it wrong. So it wasn't about star
All
trails.
right. No,
So
I've covered it anyway.
so Nell actually wrote starburst, and she was referring to where you just showed us that image with the 9 flashes. So what was the aperture on that one?
That would have been slightly higher because if we had a relatively wide aperture, like I've been talking about pretty much for most of the work, so say something like f4, f5, the starburst wouldn't really be very emphatic. It would be a bit limp. It wouldn't really come out with that lovely burst effect. So I think I pumped the aperture up. I can even maybe, let's see if it'll allow me to have a look. Depends if I ran this through the right. Let me just have a quick look. We'll see if we can find the answer for you. No, because sometimes I run my images through the print mechanism in Lightroom and it strips away the metadata. It would have been a much higher, the answer in short is a much higher aperture. So something like maybe f11, something like that would help to give that kind of, that punchy kind of starburst effect that you're seeing there.
Brilliant. Well, while we stick with this image, because we had a question that was actually about one of the first ones in this sequence, but it's relevant to the question here. So obviously we've got the starbursts in this sequence, obviously. So we know you took 9 flashes, and then I'm presuming, and this is where the question leads in, David, is obviously the pillar itself, the statue itself, or the stone.
Yeah.
Is that a flash? Is that a flash of your torch, or is that a flash unit?
It's my torch. This is something that I do a lot in my landscape imagery. If the moon isn't on my side, like I say, if there's not enough ambient light around and it's not very bright or the light's quite flat, I will use my torch to sometimes help kind of accentuate the features within the landscape. And in this particular occasion, I was just off to the left-hand side of the camera frame, standing just behind that tuft of grass, aiming my torch. As you can see, the pillar is lit from the left-hand side. I'm aiming my torch from the side across the pillar structure, which is why those lovely details in the top have been picked out so beautifully at the very top of the structure. And I've just kind of wafted it up and down the pillar and then very quickly kind of dappled the light across the ground just to pick out some detail in the grass.
Brilliant. I'm going to let you crack on. There's a couple that I still want to ask you, but obviously we're just aware of time, and in case people are leaving us, let's look at, because
no worries.
I know you want to show them the abstract stuff as well, so let's do that first.
Yeah. Let's get into this really quickly, because I think this is a really interesting body of work to show you in comparison to the landscape work, because it's completely different. And yeah, they're very similar processes in terms of how the work is made. But as we touched upon earlier, this guy Patrick Rushol in Canada makes this wonderful kit called the Light Blade kit, where you attach this kind of Kaio. It's called this Kaio system to the top of a torch head, and you thereafter attached a series of different acrylic shapes and cuttings to the top of the torch. As you can see there, that's me in my house testing out a couple of different setups. I've stuffed a couple of colored gels into the base of the torch, as you can maybe see, just poking out the bottom of the image there. And I've ran a couple of Sharpie pens around the edges of the acrylic. You can see the left edge there is quite blue, and on the right and some green. I've just changed the colors of the Sharpies that I've used on the acrylic, and that helps give off and emit different color that's coming through the torchlight. These tools are, like I said earlier, really versatile and hands-on. You can sand them, you can smooth them, you can polish them, you can paint them to alter the effects that they eventually kind of create and produce during a long exposure. Here's a completely different shape. I'll show you the effects that were created by tools very similar to these in just a second. So you can see again a couple of colored gels taped to the bottom or squeezed into the bottom of the fitting there to help the light travel through the acrylic structure to kind of emit different color. So here we go. We're going to start with a really punchy image. This is just me going hell for leather in front of the camera in a blackout studio. I'm not outdoors. I'm in a blackout studio that I sometimes use for either testing out some new light painting kit or teaching workshops, because obviously it's nice and safe in there and we don't have to worry about the weather. So this is me standing in front of the camera, just wafting that thing around like mad. Lots of energy going on there. Slightly more refined approach here. We're just kind of slightly more minimal approach. I mean, you can follow every single sweep of the light blade through the shot and the acrylic, and I love the aesthetic that the acrylic produces. And the reason I thought it'd be interesting to show you and the listeners this work tonight is because we're stripping away the landscape entirely here. We're just looking at light painting in the rawest sense on its own in a dark room. And I've always found it really fascinating that the word photography, the Greek word photography, actually translates as light painting, as painting with light. So there's another reason you have to give light painting a go. It's literally what photography means. And this is the rawest and kind of crudest form of photography imaginable, waving light around in front of a camera in the darkness. And as you'll see, some of the shapes in the images are incredibly kind of sculptural and quite elegant looking, whereas others will be a bit more jagged. Maybe I like this one as well. This one, I don't know if it reminds you and the listeners of this, but it reminds me of those kind of those glass factories where they melt the glass and create bowls and shapes out of molten glass. It almost feels like that. It's as if I'm bending the light somehow through the plastic. Well, I guess that's literally kind of happening. But yeah, such a freeing and expressive process using the light blades. I tend to, unlike my outdoor work where I kind of plan the session and plan and structure the shot, this is the opposite of that. And I've really enjoyed making this work earlier this year because I found this incredibly freeing. I've kind of switched that organizational side of my brain off and just switched the lights off and got moving in front of the camera without any real plan, and just got experimenting. Light painting is all about experimenting. Again, we'll walk through these fairly quickly because they're all relatively similar. Just using different shapes of acrylic and different colors and different strengths of light to create different effects. These have all been created using a much higher aperture. It's probably worth pointing that out as well because it's pitch black and the light coming through the torch is quite bright, although I can alter that. I think my apertures were up somewhere about f12 to f16, something like that, for making most of this work. Otherwise, the light was just overexposing. And again, coming back to that question we had earlier, here's some more starbursts that have been added into a completely different kind of setting and shot. So I've walked through the frame, moving the light blade around. I've walked back into the frame, kind of second guessed roughly where I would like the starbursts to appear, and then just kind of very quickly flashed my torch with a colored gel on the end of it directly towards the camera to create that starburst effect. And we'll see a few of these. Quite sci-fi. And yeah, you can imagine how I made that work. I just literally raised my arm up and then kind of very quickly kind of feathered the light off to the side of the frame. Again, very sculptural, flowing images. I find these very calming to look at. And that one in particular, harking back to what I mentioned a moment ago, it reminds me of that kind of bending and molten kind of glass. Really interesting effect. A completely different aesthetic to what I've created in many of my other light paintings, which I think is why I enjoyed making this particular series of work so much. So here are the little gels that I use. You can buy little gel packs from various different companies online, and I stuff these gel packs normally under the light blades, as you saw a moment ago, but in this particular occasion, well, this is very much a side point. I am obsessed with Formula One. It's probably my favorite sport. And I wanted to create some light paintings that were a homage to the sport during lockdown because I missed it so much. And Formula One's all about speed and power and energy. And I selected a bunch of gels that represent some of the F1 teams, cut little strips of them off, and attached those colors underneath. It's a terrible picture, I'm afraid, but you'll get the gist. It's a fiber optic brush tool that Jason Page sells through his website. And again, the idea being that you shine a torch up through that fitting right there that you're looking at, and the fiber optics light up all different colors. And I then went back into the blackout studio, and these are much finer lines, a completely different aesthetic to the light blades, and then moved around the fiber optic tool pretty close to the camera to create this wonderful kind of streaking effect, and to kind of to give off this sense of speed and power and motion using all of those different colors that I just spoke about. And very interestingly, not that it's come to anything yet, but it just goes to show, you never know. By uploading some of this work online, I had a really interesting inquiry from someone involved in motorsport. It's not come to fruition yet, so I'm not going to jinx myself by saying any more. But yeah, you know, if you upload work and tag the right things when you've had an idea, good stuff can come out of it. And this, fingers crossed, will lead to me maybe being commissioned to make some work for a sport that I absolutely adore. So we'll just look at a few more of these. It's just me, as you can imagine, running through the spaces. It's almost like performance art if you saw me making this work. Sometimes I'll make noise when I'm making the work. Sometimes I'll be completely quiet. Depends how expressive you want to be. This one's a nice panoramic image of that fiber optic tool being used in a much broader space. And there we are, back to the beginning. So let's stop there again. Jay, if you want to interject, if you have
Yeah,
more
brilliant.
questions.
I've got a handful of questions for you, mate. Let's stick with obviously these images, because obviously we know that they were done in in the blackout environment.
Yeah,
I'm as obsessed with these as I am your other images, mate. I agree with you.
nice to hear.
They're quite mesmerising, and like you said, very alien. And the one that you referred to, like the glass bulb, it must be my geekiness. But as soon as you put it on screen, and obviously and a lot of the audience know how geeky I am, I just saw the Joker, because I see it as a face, and the greens and the purples, and I see it as a smile. But I also get the reference to the glass blowing. But yeah, so but brilliant. Okay,
it's a bit. Sorry, I was just going to say it's a bit like when you're kind of cloud watching and you kind of you end up seeing various different shapes. This work is like that because it's so abstract. I've seen all sorts of. I mean, I've got hundreds of these images. I've seen some really bizarre things through the images.
So Angelica's just said the same image that I'm referring to. She sees it as a lady's shoe. It's amazing, isn't it? I mean,
amazing.
And the other thing that resonated with me, again, with my geekiness, and I know you join me in this, but I kept seeing, I remember that famous, the film The Abyss, which I absolutely adore.
Oh, I love that.
With the water, the water, the alien coming, manipulating the water. And that.
Is it that one?
Well, several of them, but they sung that sort of whole sequence from the Abyss with me. That was brilliant.
Totally, I've thought that myself several times.
Love it. Right, so let's stick with these, mate, for the first couple of questions. So obviously we know that they're sort of in a blackout environment indoors, as you said they can do them. Is there a kind of typical exposure, like an average exposure length of time for these, David?
There's not, but I can say these are much shorter than my outdoor work because I'm not having to expose for the landscape using any ambient light and waiting for the landscape to fully expose during a long exposure. These are short and sweet and very snappy. So I'm maybe running, believe it or not, even like a 5-second shot. I'm just jumping in there, flying around with a light blade as energetically as I can, and then running back behind the camera to have a quick look, and then just repeat. Very quick fire kind of exercise. And I like that about this work because, like I say, it's more to do with, without getting too artsy about this, it's more to do with the absence of thought and just the freedom of expression and the freedom of movement to make this work, rather than kind of breaking the shackles of having any kind of exact plan.
Brilliant. And aperture for these type of ones, mate?
Higher, somewhere around f12 to f16 typically.
Brilliant. So let's stick with if there is a rough time for the average exposures on your outside landscape stuff. Is there typically sort of length of time?
They all vary depending on the moonlight and the conditions that are in front of me. But typically, my outdoor work tends to sort of span anything between maybe 3 and 6 minutes. That kind of window of time. Sometimes I'll maybe extend that to about 8 minutes, but very rarely do I go much longer than that unless I'm targeting star trails or something. But I cannot. I mean, the time it takes me to spin an orb, for example, is about 30 seconds. And when I'm running maybe one of those ribbon structures across the shot, again, that's maybe 10 seconds. So depending on how much light painting I'm going to be doing within the shot, that also kind of partly influences the length of the shot sometimes. But the light painting element's normally much shorter than the length of the exposure required for the landscape. So I've normally got plenty of time left at the end.
Brilliant. So these are actually two, I've only got a couple of questions left because you've answered a lot, so I kind of deleted them as we went through, as I knew you were going to talk about settings and things. I thought this was an interesting question. You can tell us if it works or whether you've had any experience with it. With the double orbs,
Yeah,
question came in from Guy with regards to, obviously you showed us that you've got like that you've got it on the drill, the power drill, and what
pole.
was it,
Yeah.
2 meters? Did you say the pole was?
Yes, and there's a smaller pole that's 1.5 meters, which is what I use to create the smaller orb.
So the question that Guy asked, so would, in theory, would it work if you had, obviously you got the lights at the tip of each, at the end of the poles. If you'd
Yeah.
set some lights higher up the pole, would that effectively create the double orb?
It would, but not as fully as you see in that image now. It's a really good question, Guy. I have tried that in my early days of experimenting with all different kinds of approaches and techniques. And yes, it does work. You will see the remnants of an orb within the orb, but not as bright as the one I just showed you because the lights are on the side of the pole. When you turn the pole around, which you're doing as you walk through that full 360 around that central point in the ground, the lights are momentarily hiding themselves from the camera. They're not facing the camera because they're hiding themselves behind the pole, if that makes sense. Whereas the lights on the end of the pole are fully, fully visible to the camera lens throughout the entirety of the exposure.
Brilliant. And this was, I thought this came in quite, when we were talking about the drones earlier, and obviously you said, so the question was from Emily, beside the drones, do you think, have you thought about how else light painting might progress in the future? Or have you got some things that you've got in your head that you're prepared to share or thinking about?
Um, so it's a really interesting question. I could deliberate for some time on that one. So my shooting from the hip, my initial reaction is, what are my current plans? Let's start with that. So a couple of things. I do want to do some figurative light painting work. It's something I've not done much of to date. And using these light blades and things like the fiber optic tools, I've seen some work online that I think is beautiful, where people have run the fiber optic threads over parts of the body, maybe picking out fingers or the side of someone's face or the contours of a body. Quite stunning work. I'd like to try something like that soon. And even with a model, actually try and a bit like Eric Paré, who I showed you his work earlier, where he uses fiance and he spins the light tubes. He very kindly sent me a selection of his light tubes to use just before lockdown started, and they've sat there in my cupboard ever since. So I'm desperate to use them at some point. So again, I'm quite excited about the idea of using them with people in front of them as I spin them around to try and master that technique that he does so well. So how will light painting in general evolve? Well, let's find out. I mean, like I say, go on to that light painting group that I mentioned earlier on Flickr called Light Junkies. Have a look at what people around the world are up to with light painting right now. It will astound you. And I've tried to make my ebook as thorough as possible, and those 4 guys I briefly spoke about earlier were therefore the best light painters on the planet, and they very kindly agreed to be part of my ebook because I wanted this to be almost like a Bible on light painting and be as thorough and as detailed as possible, not only listing techniques that I know about, but listing techniques that they've mastered, that they have created tools for. It's the A to Z on light painting, essentially. So hopefully, if any of you do check it out, you'll find it incredibly useful. It's packed full of really useful little hints and tips. Let's not missay that again. It's dangerous.
Love it.
That will save you loads of time in the long run, because in my early days of light painting, albeit it was a huge amount of fun, I spent months getting my head around some of the aspects of it, which you could do in a matter of seconds just by reading the right bit of text about it.
The last question I have before I've got some other stuff to share with you is Rob has asked if you know, is the pixel stick hard to get anymore, because he'd like to buy a spare but he doesn't seem to be able to find it. Is that something you know about, David?
My pixel stick's been alive and well since the first day I've had mine, so I've never found the need to go in search of buying another one. So I don't know, and B, I know a couple of people that have come in my workshops have thereafter gone out and bought a pixel stick after seeing that crazy tool in action. I know that there is a UK distributor, or there was a UK distributor of pixel sticks last year. I don't know who they are. I can find out if you like.
Well, like I said, if you can, that'd be great. I remember meeting.
I'll try.
Like we discussed this last week. I met the guys, but it was a few years ago. At the photography show, and they were giving us a demonstration. So when you told me about it, it wasn't anything new to me. at all, and
Yeah.
remembered meeting the guys from America because they were over, but I don't know who the distributor is. But we'll try and find out for you, without a doubt.
Yeah, and by all means, go onto the pixelstick.com, I think it is, website. I believe they still ship from the US. You might save a few quid buying it from the UK, but from experience, from other people telling me about this, I think the UK distributors, they do hike up the price a little bit, which kind of negates, the advantage of buying it more locally. But have a look, see what you can compare online. There'll be forums that discuss this online with light painters as well. Like I say, light painters are really well known for helping other people find what they need. It's a really sharing community. So have a look online. Come to me if you need any further help, and I'll find you an answer.
Brilliant. I'll give you a reminder tomorrow, and maybe we'll make a list of those people that you've referred to tonight and the tools that they've got available, isn't it? And we can share that with them on the Photographer Academy Facebook page without any fear of that. Mate, I'm just checking that I don't think I've missed anything, but I don't think that I have, to be honest. Look, we'd be stupid not to plug it, and we are going to plug it because they've just spent that time with us, and you've given them such top tips for free. But obviously, look, David's in step-by-step guide to light painting. His ebooks are available now, and you've got a deal on the two of them as well on your book page on your site. So it is davidgilliver.com/product-category books, but the links are in your chat panel. You'll see them on our Facebook page as well as your email tomorrow.
Yeah, just go to davidgilliver.com. You'll find it. They're really easy to track down. And I hate peddling my wares online. I really do. But like I say, I adore teaching this technique, and that book it's an absolute labor of love. I've put everything I know into it so that others can hopefully master this wonderful process as well.
Well, and the other thing, we're yet to pen in a date in, but we're going to sort out the date. So we're going to have you back soon to look at your macro and your toy photography, which I love as well. Yeah. So I'm really looking forward to that. And obviously, I know the environment is changing every day, but at some point, obviously, you're going to be able to bring the workshops back as well, David. So, it's important that people sign up to your newsletter again via your website or your social media so they can keep an eye on that, because we're starting, yes, not in the groups or possibly we could do before, but things are changing with that. So the workshops will be coming back. So sign up to David's newsletter so you can keep posted on that. And like I said last week, mate, clearly, obviously, we've got a lot in common, but I'm coming. I love Scotland anyway, so when we can do it, I'll be there. And I'm thinking actually it'd be nice that we can do it, and maybe we get you down here when we can, and maybe even try, as much as it'll be hard at night, maybe we can try and get some film of it as well for the guys. But we've got an amazing stone structure, coastal stone structure, literally 5 minutes from the studio. So I know that it'll be, right up.
Oh, that sounds good. And listen, I'll get you to speak to Dennis, because I know he's made several short films about his journey into light painting and kind of documented the process. It is definitely possible, I promise you. We could do something really cool with that.
No, well, definitely. Well, as with things are changing all the time, but I think we've got a great fit with you and us, and clearly the audience want to see more about it. So brilliant. Look, guys, thank you so much for joining us again tonight. I've loved it. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I've seen it. I didn't know how it was done, and now I'm intrigued as well. So, and equally, that my passion probably will be more with your toy photography anyway, but definitely a great insight. So I've got to thank you, not only from the people in the chat panel, mate, that has lit up basically with praise anyway for the last 2 weeks.
Great stuff.
Look, guys, a few of you have asked, we did say at the beginning, maybe you joined us late, the part 1, it is standalone, but if you haven't seen it, it's live on the Photographer Academy and will be on the Photographer Academy YouTube page, both of them within the next few weeks. But if you're an Academy member, even if you've got the basic free membership, you can go along and watch the webinar recordings. Well, this one will be live probably tomorrow, but last week's is already there for you to catch up on. And just a couple of quick subtle plugs. Like I said, David's been in the magazine a few times now, so if you haven't checked out the Big Photo Academy e-zine, this was from a couple of months ago where David had the cover about his toy photography, which is what we're going to visit next. You've been in the paper today. Was it the Telegraph you were in today, David?
Yeah, it was the Daily Telegraph, and if anyone is up early enough, I think I'm on BBC Radio 4 tomorrow at 7:40 talking about some of the macro and miniature work that I make.
Brilliant. I won't be up early enough, so sorry about that. Actually, I will. I'll be up getting ready to come to work. But maybe I'll get it in the car on the way in. So I'll definitely be listening. But yeah, so it was great to see you in the Telegraph today. And was that specifically
Thanks.
the kind of stuff you've been doing about around the pandemic and stuff with the toy photography?
Yeah, yeah. During lockdown, I mean, away from the world of light painting, which I've not been able to work on too much because of the current restrictions, I turned my attention to all of the macro and figurine photography that I'm maybe even better known for. And because I've got a small home studio that I work from and create these little miniature scenes in, I just fully focused on that and created a new series called Pandemic, which is kind of a slightly light-hearted take on some of the the news stories that we've been subjected to over the last 5 or 6 months.
Well, we were discussing it before, and as much as it is a serious thing, it's brilliant to see an artist's take on those things and using their skills to document those things. And you did it brilliantly. I absolutely, I saw them, as I said, on your Facebook page a couple of days ago, and then you told me about the Telegraph that I saw today, and obviously people are talking to you about it. So I think it's important. We, as I think we discussed last week, we opened up the magazine to Lockdown Life. We wanted to see how people were documenting this unprecedented time. I think it's important that we do have these things, and like yourself, documenting these things. And I don't think it's light-hearted.
I think so.
It's just it's an expression in how we see the world and using our natural God-given skills to to share that with people. So no, total respect to that, mate. Brilliant. So look, the guys, the magazine's there. This obviously was a few months ago, but gives you an insight into David's macro work. We're going to get him back in a few weeks to do that specifically for us on one of these webinars, which I'm really looking forward to. But mate, seriously, I've enjoyed the last 2 weeks. I know we're going to be great friends following this, and hopefully we'll.
Well, thanks for having me.
We'll get together. Like you said, we'll definitely try and arrange some film together as things change now, probably into the new year. Get involved with us, guys. Let's see your light painting. Let's see your photography. You can do that through the magazine itself. Get involved with us on Instagram, or I didn't mention it earlier, but there's the Photographer Academy members photos critiques, and as John, one of our regular submitters, said he was in the top 5 last year, with light painting, which I remembered as he told me in the chat panel. So let's see some of that in there as well. And if it's not a competition, our photo critiques, it's completely anonymous. You do need to be an Academy member, but as I said, you can join up for free if you're not already a member to take part. And we do pick our favourite 5 each critique, and our friends at Loxley Colour will print that free of charge for you as a 20x16. So a nice way to create some art on your wall, or to build a portfolio. So get involved with us there as well. Again, thanks, David. Thanks you all for joining us. It's been another great night.
Pleasure.
Can't wait for the toy photography, mate. We'll be chatting anyway. Guys, take care. Thanks again, mate. You take care. Speak to you soon. All the best.
You too. Bye, everyone.